Stop. Just stop messing with it.
Cedric was no stranger to these places, these frantic moments between life and death. But having Alanis in his ear the entire time made it worse than it had ever been before. The old, worn-out screens, buttons, and switches on the ancient Reliant hovered beneath the tips of his fingers, beckoning, telling him without words that there was a solution somewhere in the perfect pattern of strikes and presses. But the metal and plastic were cold, and behind him, his partner was hot with fury. Raking a hand through his hair, Cedric whipped around to face her. She had her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to hold the grief inside. Her short, dark hair hung in her face, stuck to her forehead with sweat in some places. He found it so odd that, in their floating tin can, which took them through the frozen emptiness of space, Alanis could be sweating, and it made him stare at those strands for longer than was polite.
Cedric,
she snapped, and he met her eyes, only realizing once he did that he had been avoiding doing so for a reason. Alanis, usually so full and bright with life, was hollow, and it left him reeling. "What?" he answered, tonelessly. "First, you want me to try to fix things, and then when I do, you tell me to stop. Why don't you just go sit down, Alanis, or try to get some sleep?" Her jaw worked.
The captain goes down with his ship, right?
His anger was like a flash fire, the leash on his temper non-existent lately. "Stop being so fucking melodramatic." She flinched, but he felt no remorse for it. "We've got at least 2 days of oxygen left, and frankly, calling yourself a captain of anything when your ship is probably worth more in scrap is a bit too generous. Just let me work, okay?"
You're just bleeding more air out into space.
"I've told you this a dozen times now. If there is a clog, I'm trying to dislodge it. Losing a few minutes of air to bring the whole system back online is a fair trade, if you ask me."
Look at me, Cedric,
Alanis demanded, and when he did, he found that she was still just as hollow.
We both know it's not a blockage. The best thing to do is to go low power and wait for someone to respond to the beacon. You know the military isn't going to just leave a derelict gunship floating out there, and once they figure out that they've lost contact with us, they'll send somebody else. And then they'll be close enough to hear our distress.
His laugh was cruel. The fact that you think that even a single one of those assholes at Vanguard Station is going to give us one thought is sort of sad. So, again, let me work, unless you're ready to, I don't know, accept your fate or some cliche bullshit. Just get out of here. Alanis turned her face away. The lights above flickered, but that was nothing new. Then she left, down the hallway and back to her quarters, her steps echoing through the ship's interior like a heartbeat, until her door shut behind her, and things were still. He lowered his head into his hands and exhaled slowly, knowing that his thundering heart, which was demanding he breathe harder, was just another mechanism to drive him closer to suffocation.
It's just like you to let her die. Let me guess, if things get too dire, you'll just kill her yourself, so you can have a few more precious lungfuls?
Cedric turned in his creaking seat slowly to see his wife, waterlogged, green, and beautiful, sitting across from him. The bundle in her arms was still, but from the way she strained, almost unbearably heavy.
That's what you're good at, after all.
She continued, bouncing the thing in her grasp absent-mindedly. A puddle of briny seawater pooled around her feet slowly, dripping from the tendrils of her hair and her soaked clothing. The shirt, even wet, was oddly large.
Let us all die, so you can go on, right?
She tried to sleep at first, but it served no purpose. Alanis overanalyzed every lungful of air she pulled in, every groan and shifting of the ship beneath her feet, and the increasingly frantic sounds of her only crewmate on the flight deck, looking for something they both knew he would never find. A solution. One of the things that she kept thinking about the most was how much she hated the name of the fucking ship she had bought from an auction years ago and restored slowly until she was able to take conscription work. Reliant had been painted on the side in fading brick red, and Alanis had kept it as an homage to the years the ship had spent under someone else in a different life. But now it felt like a joke. The Reliant's warp drive had failed in one spectacular jolt, throwing them out of hyperspace with such force that she had been thrown against the console and knocked unconscious. When she awoke, Cedric had been nearly frozen in shock, sitting in front of the status screens and flicking through the reports again and again, as if on autopilot. "We aren't reading Oxygen Tank 1 or 2, he had told her robotically. "We're on reserves, maybe 8 hours, if we're lucky." Either the tanks had been dislodged or the ship was damaged in such a way that it wasn't able to utilize the main life support system. Normally, it would have been an easy spacewalk to determine if the tanks were gone or irreparably damaged, but the extra energy it would cost them, both mechanically and to their physical bodies, would be a death sentence to at least one of them. Well, a slower one anyway, because from what Alanis could tell, they were both going to die.
Fucking Reliant,
she thought, poking the bloody lump on her forehead under the sweep of her bangs from where she had been knocked out.
I saved this ship from getting melted down and turned into girders, and this is the thanks I get.
Life hadn't been bad for Alanis, all things considered. But she had felt since the day she turned 18 that she was destined for more than the lot she was given. It's what spurred her to buy a ship with her enlistment bonus, and what made her start taking risky jobs once she was out of the military and on her own. She was so sure that one day, one job was going to make this gray and neutral life of hers come into full color. Maybe she would save a life, or, like she thought in her wildest dreams, be the first ship on the scene to save an entire crew. But all that captaining the Reliant had taught her was that there was very few heroes in the world. Her and Cedric had towed in an unknowable number of ships that were cold and dark inside, the still and silent crew floating lifelessly, but they had never saved a single soul. Which made her think, not for the first time, why Cedric had even taken the job with her. Alanis didn't pay much, and the quarters she had given the mechanic left a lot to be desired. But Cedric was desperate to get off Earth, so much so that she hadn't seen the man relax until the pale blue dot was fading away behind them. They barely knew each other, even now. At least who they really were. And in turn, Alanis had little interesting to say about hers. She had no tragic backstory, no lost loves. That was the problem. She had nothing. She was nothing. And now she never would be. And that's what kept her up. Kept her from possibly sleeping through the inevitable suffocation and dying peacefully. She was sick with the idea of going out of existence the same way she had lived in it. Quiet, uneventful, and without a fight. They had around 7 hours left. She had to decide how many of them she was going to spend laying on the hard mattress in her quarters, staring at the yellowing ceiling. Alanis had just closed her eyes when she heard the whirring that indicated that Cedric had activated the distress beacon. It made her sit up, in bed, surprised. They were both well aware that they were in empty space, and the chances of anyone passing close enough to find them was slim to none, and he had refused to even consider wasting the extra power. Although they both knew it wasn't going to be that which took them out. Oxygen was always going to be the culprit. It wasn't that strange that her crewmate had a change of heart about maximizing their chances for rescue, and it gave her a glimmer of hope that maybe he wouldn't run her off again if she tried to join him. There was a strange, aching emptiness that eclipsed her fear of death, and that emptiness was the knowledge that they might each die alone. Not quite strangers, not quite friends, but they were both still human, at least. Alanis didn't bother putting her shoes on, and the chill of the sheet metal floor bled up through the soles of her feet into the core of her body as she made her way back out to the command deck. Cedric had abandoned the diagnostic screens and was at the main system screen now. He seemed stiff, his shoulders pushed back and his neck forward, but it wasn't like she could fault him for feeling that way.
Cedric.
She spoke into the quiet. He didn't turn, but she knew he heard her.
What's the status?
I thought you were sleeping, was all he said. Alanis knew that meant it's all the same.
No.
She responded simply, coming up beside him. On his screen was something curious, the drive signature of another ship, a rescue and recovery ship.
What is this?
She breathed, sinking into the seat next to him. He didn't move aside to let her see better, but her pulse was pounding all the same.
Cedric, did someone answer the beacon in such a short time?
They weren't coming for us. They were in hyperspace heading to the wreck of a civilian transport ship when they caught the beacon. He blew out a breath, fidgety and nearly vibrating with anxiety. They, dropped out of hyperspace when they heard it, but the comms aren't working right either. I don't think they can hear us, but I heard them pretty clearly.
So, that's it?
Alanis was in disbelief.
We're going to be okay?
No. Fuck, no we aren't. He licked his lips, raking his hands through his hair. Maybe, I don't know, from what I heard from them, the civilian ship they are on their way to hasn't communicated or shown any signs of life for over 12 hours now. So if they can confirm that we're alive over here, they'll adjust course and come to us instead. But they don't have enough fuel for both. There are a few ways I could hail them without the comms being up, but we'd be sentencing that other ship to death if there are still survivors. Alanis swallowed hard past the lump in her throat.
But if they haven't received confirmation of signs of life...
It's a transport, Alanis. If their ship lost life support, or whatever happened to them was isolated to one part of the ship and the survivors have no way of getting to any sort of communication, who's to say they would even know how to use it? We can't divert rescue just to save ourselves. She felt her stomach drop to her feet.
How many are aboard the transport?
When Cedric looked over at her finally, his pupils were pinpricks. Between 80 and 100 passengers. Tilting her head towards the ceiling, she let the heartache wash over her in one intense wave before tucking it away. There was no time for such things.
I wish you hadn't told me.
She closed her eyes to keep any errant tears at bay. but it made her nearly jump out of her skin when Cedric spoke next, hissing in her ear so closely that she felt his breath on her skin. "Why wouldn't I? My blood is already on your hands. Why not a few dozen more? Or 100 more? Selfish murderer." The words he spoke so fast that it sounded like he was on fast forward, and Cedric's tone was so full of venom that she reeled back, eyes popping wide open.
Is that what you think?
Alanis snapped in shock. Cedric was back fully in his seat, mouth no longer against the shell of her ear, a question in his exhausted eyes. "What are you talking about?"
Do you think I'm a murderer?
There was a thread of hysteria in her voice. "Allie." On the tail end of the horrible things he had said, the nickname made her flinch. "No. We both know the right choice here, and unless I've completely misjudged you, I'm sure we're on the same page."
But that's what you called me just now.
His gaze shuddered, looking over her shoulder for a long moment before putting his attention back on her fully. "No, I didn't. What are you talking about?" She stood so quickly that her chair, locked into place but free spinning, made a few jerky rotations on its own.
I need a second.
Alanis blurted out, clenching and unclenching her fists, the bump on her forehead only adding to the all-consuming migraine starting to set into her skull. The door to her quarters was a few feet away when she felt hands on her shoulders, like ice-cold vices, and Cedric's voice in her ear again. So close that he might as well have been speaking against her skin. Alanis hadn't even heard him behind her. The metal floors didn't lend themselves well to sneaking, but she swallowed the yelp of fear before it could escape her lips. "You'd really let me die for a bunch of strangers?" Cedric whispered sharply. "It's your fault that I'm even here. And now you're content to just let me die, monster, murderer." Whipping around, she tried to grab at him and hold him in place, but her crewmate was nothing but empty air when she did so. Except, she could see the dark ginger of his head over the back of his seat, back at the front of the ship, seemingly oblivious. Quivering with anxiety, her trust in her own sanity bleeding away by the second, Alanis grabbed the handle of the door and pulled. But right before she stepped inside, she heard her partner speak again, the vitriol in his words replaced with an unending sorrow. "Did you know that I had a daughter?" His words hit her like the crack of a whip, echoing in the ship with how loudly he had to speak so she could hear him. But Alanis simply entered the room and shut the door behind her. At that point, she had no idea if it was actually Cedric speaking, or just the ghost of her own despair. Her weight falling back against the closed door, she slid to the floor, head falling into her open palms and silent sobs racking her body, like the quaking of the earth she had left behind.
Did you think she'd listen to you?
Sarah asked her husband, now walking pointless lines across the ship.
You can't dilute your sins by confessing them at the end, Cedric. Drink them down and be done with it.
He didn't respond to her, the silence of her steps reassuring him that she was just a figment of his slowly deteriorating mind. It was too soon for the lack of oxygen to be noticeable enough that he would hallucinate so vividly, but he figured he had already been teetering on his mental breakdown. And the slow march towards the end was what finally sent him over. The thing was, a part of him wished it was real. He'd take her in any form, living and warm, or dead and soaked with seawater. The biggest regret of his life was not drowning with her, miles out in the Atlantic on a boat he was too inexperienced to drive, but had been rented out to him anyway. He had scraped the old thing against a jutting bit of coral, but paid it no mind until it was too late. Sarah was 9 months pregnant, and too weak to keep floating until rescue eventually came once the rental wasn't returned on time. It was supposed to be their last blissful trip before they became parents, but she had begged him to not let her drown. Begged.
I know you're thinking about it.
Sarah's ghost exhaled.
I hope it torments you every minute of every day.
Outside, the stars wheeled by, bright and garish in the cold vacuum of it all. Cedric didn't turn to look back at the specter of the terrible, beloved thing she carried in her arms, but he couldn't let that comment pass by. Of course it fucking does, Sarah. How many nights had he dreamt about her, all alone on the floor of the ocean, unreachable? An empty grave that he could never mourn at, a nursery that he locked and never entered again. The dilapidated hunk of the Reliant and its featureless insides were an answered prayer compared to all of that. Now, though, he was sick with the thought of spending eternity, a lifetime, and more away from her. And their daughter. He had severed himself from that man, husband, and expectant father, only to have that identity come crashing back down on top of him in his final hours. A mourning veil he could never shirk. And when he tried to exorcise himself of those locked away parts of him to the only person around, Alanis, had shut the door, leaving his sputtered cry for help bouncing around the air around him, unheard or unacknowledged.
If only Daddy had been stronger.
She cooed to the bundle, her voice echoing and reverberating around him.
If only he could have held us up longer. Now you've tricked another woman into trusting you, and she's going to die too.
As the minutes passed, Sarah had grown grayer and more gaunt, the tendrils of her dark braids dripping along with her clothes. And when she stepped into his line of vision, it terrified him so much that his stomach turned inside him.
At least you have the chance of saving this one. But you won't. Better to save a possible group of nameless faces than her,
She moved closer, and he turned his head so far away that his neck hurt. More than anything, he dreaded seeing what was in her arms. Had seen it in his nightmares for years now. Had wondered if Sarah clutched her stomach as she hit the sandy bottom of the sea to hold their daughter into eternity. He knew he was going to be sick, and the logical part of his mind railed at him for all the extra energy and oxygen the act of purging would use. The beacon whirred. Cedric retched, and then the oxygen alarm began to sound. Alanis found Cedric passed out cold, curled around the toilet like it was an effigy, the smell of bile in the thinning air. She left him like that, feeling her heart cracking loudly enough that for a moment it drowned out her fear and choking sorrow. Her head was full of whispers now, hissing like a snake, rattling in her brain like the warning of a copperhead, dry and rasping at the inside of her ears. The voice was still that of her crewmate, but seeing him unconscious, sick on the corner of his slack mouth, helped her come back to the reality, as bleak as it was. She went to her ragged, cracked leather captain's chair and took in the screens and diagnostics. The din of the oxygen alarm was unavoidable, and she tried to put it at the back of her mind. It wasn't lost on her how her vision seemed to swim, and no matter how quickly she sucked in air, she never felt satisfied. But there was still that pure, distilled, achingly human seed of hope in her that she couldn't quite silence. She mused on the transport ship that would receive the salvation her and Cedric would be denied, about the passengers, and hoped that the rescuers might mention the smaller ship they had passed up in order to save them. The idea of her existence being forgotten the instant she breathed her last made her chest tight with panic. Alanis left no legacy, no children, no contributions to society. Nothing. "Did you know that I had a daughter?" Cedric, or at least the voice that took his identity, had said. It made her sad, more than any thoughts about her own wasted life, to think of his little girl waiting for him back at home. Cedric had taken so little time off that the idea that he might actually have a child was hard for her to comprehend, but maybe he and the mother were estranged. Now, her rickety ship was going to steal any future the two may have, and that truth settled over her like an icy second skin. When she exhaled slowly, and she could see her breath in the air, it occurred to Alanis that it wasn't just her guilt making her chilled. The ship was actually freezing. "Are you going to just let him die on the freezing bathroom floor, covered in vomit?" the voice rasped. Then, "Are you really going to just let him die?" Her eyes flicked to the screens again and back. The image of a tiny girl with auburn hair played across her mind's eye. Her fingertips flew across the keyboard, and then stopped. She ran to get Cedric off the bathroom floor, sucking in air audibly when she reached him and shook the man awake. He was groggy as he sat up, and she wet a cloth in the sink to clean his face. When he was fully conscious again, he watched her with careful eyes. She pretended she didn't see the way the corners of his lips were blue. "It's close," Cedric said simply, and Alanis nodded, helping him to his feet. Then, unexpectedly, he pulled her into his arms, and that moment of pure human connection rocked her. It wasn't until the sob escaped her, and an answering one came out of him, that she realized how much she didn't want to be alone.
"Tell me about your daughter."
He froze, gaze once again going distant as he looked out the bathroom door behind her, before he shook his head hard. "I can't. She's dead." There were a million things Alanis wanted to say to him, words of comfort and understanding, even though she couldn't understand the depth of his loss at all, but words were a precious commodity for them now. Instead, she took him by the hand and led him to the open door of her quarters, and they lay on top of the black duvet, forehead to forehead, and hands linked together, held to their chests as if in prayer. They had so few breaths left, so they shared them, eyes closed, the scant warmth of their bodies barely enough to keep the numbness away. "You're shaking," Cedric told her, and she nodded weakly.
"I'm not afraid anymore,"
she told him, a blatant lie, but one that she desperately wanted to believe.
"I just wish it wasn't so cold."
He didn't know why, but Sarah didn't come into the room with him and Alanis, but just stood outside the door, keeping a silent, bitter vigil over him. He untangled himself from the last human in the world he would ever touch, stumbling to the machine room in the back of the Reliant, hoping to bypass the energy limiter and get the ship warm enough that Alanis was comfortable at the end. It was such a pointless, silly thing, but it was all he could give her. It was hard. His arms and hands didn't want to obey him, and his vision swam doubles. But with more strength than he thought he had left, Cedric turned the wrench, and the temperature began to climb. He stumbled as he tried to make his way back to Alanis' quarters, hitting a storage rack, hard. Something rolled against his feet, bumping into him as he sank to the ground. Pain short-circuited him, but when he forced his eyes open once more, Sarah was there again. He drew in air like a bellows, gagging on the smell of decay and brine, and the sight of her flesh melting off those cheekbones he had adored. She pushed the wrapped bundle at him, and to his horror, he heard it stir.
Take her.
Cedric moaned and tried to crawl away, but there was nothing left in him.
Take her.
So he did. Cedric took the wet, heavy weight of his daughter into his arms and forced himself to look into her face, the color of bleached bone, for the first and the final time. The baby slept and was beautiful. Wordlessly, he looked back up to his wife, but when he did, the horror of her was gone, and when he looked back down at his baby, she was gone too. The weight in his arms then was instead a silver tank, full. His vision was going, and he couldn't read the label, but he knew in his heart it had to be oxygen. When the ship had first been thrown out of the warp drive, they had torn apart the ship for tanks just like these, but the only ones they had were stored in the airlock with the spacesuits, and the damage to Reliant had jolted the airlock door open just enough for the vacuum to take over, and everything had been lost in an instant. The one he held must have been looked over, hidden under some shelf or piece of machinery. It would only give them an hour at most, and they both had come to terms with the fact that rescue was not coming, but maybe Sarah had given him this for a reason, so he would try. He owed her that much. Cedric crawled through the saltwater puddle his wife had left, pulling the first aid kit from the wall until he found the mask and attachment hose he was looking for. Then, using the door frame as leverage, he made it to his feet, followed the trail of ocean water back to Alanis' quarters, tank and mask in hand, and collapsed into the bed beside her.
Not cold.
Was all she could manage, her eyes opened with only a sliver. Both of their breathing was just rattling in their chests, an agonal hymn, but Cedric managed to affix the mask to the tank, pull his crewmate into his lap, and strap the mask over her face. She watched him with quiet, now open eyes, but didn't make a sound. Exhausted, he moved her back to the mattress and laid next to her once more, terrified, but grimly accomplished, knowing he had given her the last bit of oxygen left. He wanted none of it. He just wanted to go back to Sarah, even if the way there was the endless, airless quiet of space. Cedric closed his eyes and took Alanis' hand in his again. Her skin was warmer now, but she didn't stir. It wasn't until he concentrated on the rhythmic whirring of the distress beacon to lull him into a final rest that he heard it. The pattern the beacon was making now, instead of the steady ping it had been. 3 short pings and 3 long, over and over again. An SOS, proof of life. "What did you do?" he whispered, tears rolling down his face but too weak to sit up. "Alanis, what did you do?" She didn't answer, and he didn't let her go. But as the world went dark, he carried the one thing he hated most into the ether: guilt. Cedric knew he was dead, floating in the abyss of nothingness. But there were fits and starts of clarity that he didn't understand. Things he shouldn't have been able to see, moments that never actually happened embedding in his memory. He felt himself pulled from Alanis' bed, and he felt a third pair of fingers unknot his from hers. Then the hiss of an airlock, a punch of freezing air, and now a pressing brightness on his eyelids that he couldn't ignore. When his eyes opened, he found himself in a white room, a strange man in what looked like scrubs checking the machines he was hooked up to, a beatific smile on his face when he saw that Cedric was awake. "Oh, welcome back," Cedric asked over and over about Alanis, but the nurses that looked over him would just share uncomfortable looks and try to get him on a different subject. Cedric felt a welling of dread, but he tamped it down until the doctor finally came. After silently checking over him, the doctor, an older man, sank into the chair next to his bed. "You're incredibly lucky," he said bluntly. "Once we breached, we were sure that you were both dead, but I want you to know that your crewmate choosing to go on her own terms is no less honorable. There's no way to tell if she would have held out until we arrived anyway." It didn't make sense. He had given her the oxygen, so she would be the one here. Too exhausted for open grief, he closed his eyes and was back in the open water, alone under the night sky, sunburnt skin screaming from the salt, wishing that he was just brave enough to let go. "What do you mean, on her own terms?" The doctor's lips thinned, as if he didn't want to say, but gave Cedric the truth. "You might not remember. Hypoxia can do that to the mind. But Alanis McDowell took her own life via inhalation from an acetylene tank. If it's any solace, I'm sure she went easily. I've heard it's like drowning. Blissful.